The sun was a hammer beating down on the dry earth until the dust itself seemed to cry out. A horse stood on the road, black as coal, its mane barely moving in the blistering wind. On its back sat a man, Abel Carter, as still and silent as the granite cliffs behind him. His eyes weren't on the horizon. They were locked on the woman standing barefoot in the dirt. Her skin was burned raw, her shoulders shaking. Her name was Lena, but she didn't have the voice to say it. The only thing she wore was shame, put on her by the three men standing nearby, their faces twisted with ugly pride. They were the Graysons, her dead husband's family, and they had just decided she was worth less than nothing. They took her farm, they took her name, and then they took her last shred of dignity. Abel's voice sliced through the heat. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question, it was a fact. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The eldest Grayson, a man with eyes like broken glass, spat in the dust. "She's ours. Property. You got no business here, Carter." Abel swung down from his horse. He moved with a quiet power, a man who was part of the land itself. He untied a thick wool blanket from his saddle and walked toward Lena. He didn't hurry. His steps were measured, deliberate. Lena stared at nothing, her body trembling. She wouldn't look at them. She wouldn't look at him. He stopped in front of her. With careful hands, he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, his touch respectful, almost sacred. The wool covered her, and for the first time, the Grayson's smirks began to fade. Abel turned to face them. His voice was low, calm, but it carried the weight of a rock slide. "Get off my land." There was no yelling, no threat, just a simple, unbreakable truth. The Graysons hesitated, anger burning in their eyes, but something in Abel's stillness held them back. They spat curses, climbed into their wagon, and rattled away into the heat. The sound faded. There was only the wind. Abel lifted Lena onto his saddle, settling her in front of him. His chest was a solid wall at her back. He said nothing, asked nothing. The horse started walking, its hooves a steady rhythm on the dry earth. Each step took her further away from the cruelty, further away from the Graysons. The land was harsh, all sagebrush and red dirt. Abel rode like a man made of stone, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. His silence wasn't empty. It was a shield, a place where she didn't have to explain, didn't have to speak. For the first time in a very long time, Lena felt a flicker of something she thought was gone forever. Safety. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and blood, she studied the man who had saved her. His face was weathered, carved by sun and hard work. He was as harsh as the land itself. But as she looked closer, she saw something else in his eyes. It wasn't pity, it was a promise. A promise of what, she couldn't guess. A single lantern appeared in the distance, a tiny flame in the growing dark. It was Abel's ranch, tucked into a valley like a secret. A small house, a barn, fences that looked like they'd grown from the earth. When they arrived, he slid from the horse and lifted her down. Her legs gave way, but he held her steady. "That room's yours," he said, nodding toward a door. "Clothes are on the bed. They were my mother's." He moved to the stove and lit a fire, the crackle pushing back the night's chill. Lena went into the room and saw a simple cotton dress. It smelled of soap and sun. She slipped it on. It was loose, but it was a shield. When she came out, 2 plates of bacon and beans were on the table. They ate in silence. He asked nothing. Not her name, not her story. And that quiet mercy was a kindness so deep it almost broke her. The days that followed were built on that same silence. Abel rose before dawn and came back after dusk, leaving food for her without a word. He gave her space, but the land outside was not still. Far on the eastern ridge, a shadow was watching. Lena saw it from the porch one evening, a dark speck against the setting sun. Too far to make out, but she knew. A cold dread washed over her. It was a Grayson. They were watching the valley, waiting. The rider sat there for an hour, a silent threat that turned her newfound sanctuary into a cage. When he finally disappeared over the ridge, the air felt heavy, suffocating. That night, Abel came inside and laid an oilcloth on the table. He didn't mention the rider. He didn't have to. Instead, he began to take apart his rifle, cleaning each piece with a calm, focused precision. The metallic clicks filled the silence of the cabin. Lena watched from her chair by the fire, and she understood. His silence wasn't ignorance. It was preparation. The world hadn't forgotten about her. But Abel Carter was making sure it wouldn't get her again. But what Lena didn't know was that Abel wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing for a war. And it was a war he had been waiting to fight his entire life. The uneasy peace held for a few more days. Lena stayed inside, but she could feel their eyes on the valley. Abel moved with a new purpose, his quiet chores now looking more like a soldier securing his perimeter. He checked the fences, sharpened his axe, and spent more time on the ridges, his rifle always resting in the crook of his arm. One night, a storm rolled in, a black monster that swallowed the mountains. Wind howled and rain lashed against the cabin. Through the chaos, a sharp cry cut the air, and you struggling to give birth. Abel was up in an instant, pulling on his boots. "Stay here," he ordered, but Lena couldn't. Something pulled her out into the storm behind him. In the birthing pen, the ewe was in trouble. The lamb stuck. Abel knelt in the mud, his hands working with practiced skill. "Hold the lantern," he grunted, not looking at her. She gripped it with both hands, the wind trying to tear it away. Rain streamed down her face, but she held the light steady on his hands. He worked quickly, murmuring to the animal, his voice a low anchor in the storm's fury. For a terrible long moment, the lamb came free but lay still, lifeless. Abel's jaw was a hard line. He grabbed a piece of burlap and rubbed the small body, hard and fast. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then a faint, weak cry. The lamb kicked. It was alive. Relief hit Lena like a physical blow. Standing there in the mud and the rain, they had stared into the face of death and won. Back inside, soaked and shivering, she found her voice. Her first words to him. "Thank you." Abel just nodded, but that single gesture was a conversation. From that night, the silence between them changed. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a bridge. Lena started to venture out. She found a rusty trowel and began to work the neglected garden patch near the house. The feel of the earth under her hands was real, solid. It was proof that she was still here. One afternoon, Abel found a glass of cool water waiting for him on the porch rail. He drank it down and gave her that same simple nod. She began to mend his shirts, sweep the floors, small acts of care that were her choice. She was rebuilding her world, one small piece at a time. One evening by the fire, she finally told him everything. About her husband, a good man but a gentle one. About the fever that took him, and about the Graysons who saw her not as a widow to be helped, but as a debt to be collected. She told him about the final, humiliating day. Abel listened, his eyes on the fire. The only sign of his rage was the tight clench of his jaw. When she was done, the room was quiet. But it was a shared quiet now, a silence that held her story, her pain. But then Abel spoke, his voice low and rough. "They did the same to my sister." Lena stared at him. The air crackled. The story she thought she knew was about to be torn wide open. "Her name was Sarah," Abel said, his gaze still fixed on the flames, but seeing something far away, something long buried. "Her husband died, left her a small plot of land, not unlike yours. The Grayson's father was alive then, old man Grayson. He saw her as an opportunity." He paused, the muscle in his jaw working. "He and his boys, they did the same thing. Claimed she was property. Claimed the land was theirs by right. They broke her spirit day by day, humiliated her in front of the whole town." Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The simple cotton dress she was wearing, his mother's dress, suddenly felt heavier. "What happened to her?" Lena whispered. Abel's eyes finally left the fire and met hers. They were filled with a cold, ancient grief. "She didn't make it. One morning she walked into the river and didn't come out." He looked down at his hands, calloused and strong. "I was too young, too far away working a cattle drive. By the time I got the news, it was too late. I buried her, and I buried my mother not long after. They say it was her heart that gave out." He looked back up at Lena. "I came back here. I bought this land, this valley, because it overlooks theirs. I've been watching them for 10 years, waiting. I knew one day they'd do it again. I just didn't know it would be to you. The entire world shifted on its axis. This wasn't a random rescue. It wasn't just a good man helping a woman in need. It was a ghost story, a decade-long quest for vengeance that had finally found its moment. Abel hadn't just saved her from the Graysons. He had been hunting them, and he had just brought their next victim right into the heart of his fortress. The revelation hung between them, heavier than any storm. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by circumstance. They were allies, tied together by the Graysons' cruelty. A few days later, Lena was sorting through the few possessions she'd managed to save. A small wooden chest the Graysons had overlooked. Inside, beneath a folded quilt, was her husband Samuel's journal. She opened it, her hands trembling. She'd always assumed his notes were about crops and weather. But as she read, her blood ran cold. Samuel wasn't just a farmer. He had been suspicious of the Graysons for months. He'd been documenting their movements, late-night wagons heading north, cattle that didn't belong to them appearing in their pastures before being driven off again. He was building a case. He believed they were the leaders of a massive rustling operation that stretched across 3 territories. And then she saw the last entry, written in a shaky hand the day before he died. They know I'm watching. Jed Grayson brought me a bottle of whiskey, a neighborly gesture. Tasted strange. Feel cold. It wasn't a fever. It was murder. She took the journal to Abel that evening. He read it under the lamplight, his face unreadable. When he finished, he looked up, and the cold fury in his eyes was terrifying. This changes things, he said. They didn't just cast you out. They murdered your husband to protect their operation. The danger had escalated beyond a land dispute. They were sitting on a secret that the Graysons would kill to protect. And they had killed for it before. Abel walked to a loose floorboard near the hearth. He pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were 2 matched revolvers and boxes of ammunition. Not the weapons of a simple rancher. These were the tools of a man who expected a war. My sister's husband was a lawman, Abel said, checking the action on one of the pistols. He taught me how to use these. Taught me how to track, how to fight. After Sarah died, I spent 5 years tracking men for the Pinkertons. I got good at it. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The quiet rancher was a facade. Beneath it was a trained manhunter. The Graysons are part of something bigger, Abel continued, his voice grim. They supply stolen cattle to the railroad camps. They've got men on their payroll, maybe even the law. He looked at Lena. That journal is a death warrant. For them, or for us. The next morning, the watcher on the ridge was back. But he wasn't alone. There were 2 others with him. They weren't hiding. They were sending a message. That night, the dogs started barking, a frantic, terrified sound. Abel grabbed his rifle. Stay away from the windows, he ordered. A single gunshot echoed from the darkness. One of the dogs yelped, then went silent. A cold, calculated act of cruelty, a warning. Abel didn't fire back. He just stood in the darkened cabin, listening. They're testing us, he whispered, seeing what I'll do. He did nothing. He let them think he was scared. He let them grow confident. It was all part of the hunt. Days turned into a week. The riders on the ridge became a constant presence. They got bolder, riding closer to the valley floor. Abel and Lena worked in a tense silence, always aware of the eyes on them. They were prisoners in their own sanctuary. Then one afternoon, as Lena was tending the garden, a rifle shot cracked the air. The dirt a foot from her head exploded. She threw herself to the ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. It wasn't a warning anymore. Abel burst out of the barn, rifle in hand, and laid down covering fire towards the ridge. He pulled Lena into the house, his face a mask of cold rage. That's it, he said. The waiting is over. He didn't mean he was going to attack. He meant they were coming. The time for testing was done. The Graysons were coming to wipe the board clean. They were coming to finish what they started with Samuel and with Abel's sister. That night, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, they came. Not 3 riders, a dozen. They poured over the eastern ridge like a dark tide, their forms silhouetted against the dying light. They were coming to burn them out, to bury the secret of Samuel's journal under ash and blood. Abel handed Lena one of the revolvers. You know how to use this? She shook her head, her hand trembling as she took the cold, heavy steel. "Point it at whatever you don't want living anymore," he said, his voice deadly calm, "and pull the trigger." The siege had begun. The riders didn't charge blindly. They were smart. They spread out, using the terrain for cover, encircling the small cabin and barn. The first shots were probing, chipping away at the wooden window frames, testing the defenses. Abel didn't return fire. He watched, his eyes narrowed, tracking their movements in the failing light. "They're trying to draw us out," he whispered to Lena, who was crouched below the window line, the heavy revolver clutched in her hands. "Don't give them a target." The air grew thick with tension. The only sounds were the whine of bullets and the frantic pounding of Lena's own heart. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Then a new sound, a crackling, and a smell. Smoke. Lena's eyes widened in horror. The barn! A flicker of orange light danced against the far wall of the cabin. They had snuck around the back. They had set the barn on fire. The horses, the livestock, their winter feed, all of it was going up in flames. It was a cruel, tactical move, meant to divide their attention, to force them out into the open. Abel's face was carved from granite. He watched the flames for a second, his expression unchanging. "Let it burn," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The house is stone and sod. It won't catch. They've just shown me where they are." He lifted his rifle, took aim at the flickering silhouette of a man against the blaze, and fired. A single deafening crack. A scream tore through the night, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. The quiet rancher was gone. The hunter had taken his place. The shot ignited a firestorm. Gunfire erupted from all sides, a relentless barrage that splintered the door and shattered the one remaining pane of glass in the window. Lena pressed herself against the floor, tasting dust and fear. Abel moved with an unnatural calm, firing sparingly, deliberately. Each shot he took was answered by a cry of pain or a sudden silence from one of the attackers. He was a ghost, moving from window to window, never staying in one place for more than a second. He knew the angles of his home, the blind spots, the places of cover. He was fighting on his own ground, and he was making them pay for every inch of it. An hour passed, then two. The attack slowed, the gunfire becoming more sporadic. The barn was now a roaring inferno, casting long, dancing shadows across the yard. "They're pulling back," Abel said, reloading his rifle. "But they're not leaving." He was right. The Graysons were regrouping, waiting for the dawn. They knew they had Abel and Lena trapped. They had time on their side. In the grim, fire-lit cabin, a desperate quiet fell. Lena looked at Abel, his face blackened with soot, his eyes hard as diamonds. "They'll just wait until we're out of ammunition," she said, her voice trembling. "We won't be," Abel replied. He went back to the loose floorboard and pulled it up again. But this time he reached deeper. His hand came out with a small, leather-bound book. It wasn't Samuel's journal. It was his own. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with meticulous, hand-drawn maps of the valley. Every rock, every creek, every game trail. But there was more. He had also mapped out the Graysons' property. He had been planning this for years. "For 10 years I've watched them," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "I know their routines. I know their weaknesses." He stopped on a page that showed a series of strange symbols near a waterfall at the edge of his own property. "My father used to tell me stories about this place. Old mining tunnels, sealed up decades ago. The Graysons use the entrance on their side of the creek for their rustling operation, but they don't know there's another way in." He looked at Lena, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold fury in his eyes. It was a wild, desperate hope. "They think they have us trapped in here," he said. "They're wrong. We're not trapped with them." He leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "They're trapped out there with me." The plan was insane, a suicide mission. While the Graysons waited for sunrise to finish them off, Abel and Lena were going to disappear. They would use the cover of the burning barn and the deep shadows of the night to slip out the back, make their way to the creek, and enter the forgotten tunnels. "They think the evidence is in this house," Abel said, tapping Samuel's journal. "But the real proof is in those tunnels. Their stolen goods, their ledgers. If we can get in there, We can bring the whole rotten structure down. He handed her a canteen and a small satchel with the last of their food. Stay close. Don't make a sound. Leaving the relative safety of the stone house felt like stepping off a cliff. The air outside was thick with smoke, the heat from the burning barns scorching their faces. The world was a hellscape of orange light and deep, impenetrable shadows. They moved like wraiths, sticking to the dark side of the cabin, then darting for the cover of a low stone wall. Every snapped twig, every dislodged pebble sounded like a cannon shot in the tense silence. Above them, on the ridge, they could hear the low murmur of the Graysons' men, waiting for the light. Lena's heart was a wild bird trapped in her chest. She focused on the back of Abel's shirt, on his steady, silent movements. He was her anchor in a world that had come completely undone. They reached the creek bed, a dark gash in the earth that offered some cover. They moved downstream, half crouched, the cold water seeping into their boots. The roar of the distant waterfall grew louder, masking any sound they made. After what felt like an eternity, Abel stopped. Ahead of them, a curtain of water cascaded over a rock face. It looked like a dead end. But Abel pushed aside a thick growth of vines near the base of the falls, revealing a dark, narrow opening, a black maw that smelled of damp earth and decay. "This is it," he whispered. "The old prospector's entrance. No one's used it in 50 years. They slipped inside. The roar of the waterfall faded behind them, replaced by a profound, suffocating silence. The darkness was absolute. Abel struck a match, the sudden flare of light revealing a narrow, rough-hewn tunnel stretching into the earth. He lit a small lantern, and its weak, yellow glow pushed back the oppressive dark. "The main chamber's about a mile in," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "It connects to their system. We have to assume they have men posted, even on the inside." They moved forward, the lantern casting their shadows long and distorted against the tunnel walls. The air grew colder, staler. Water dripped from the ceiling, a rhythmic, unnerving tattoo in the silence. It felt like they were descending into a tomb. Suddenly, Abel froze. He held up a hand, pulling Lena behind him as he snuffed out the lantern. They were plunged back into total darkness. Lena held her breath, straining her ears. At first she heard nothing, then a faint scraping sound from up ahead, and a low, guttural cough. Someone was there, waiting in the dark. They stood frozen in the pitch black, the sound of their own breathing deafeningly loud. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable click of a rifle's hammer being cocked. They weren't alone in the tunnel. Abel's hand found Lena's in the dark, a silent squeeze of reassurance. He put his mouth close to her ear, his whisper a faint breath. "Stay here. Don't move." She could feel him shift away from her, a ghost in the darkness. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her hand tightened on the revolver Abel had given her, the cold steel doing little to stop the trembling in her fingers. The scraping sound moved again, now seemingly just feet in front of her. A shadow passed through the faint light filtering from the entrance far behind them. A man's voice, rough and nervous, cut through the silence. "Who's there? Jed, is that you?" Silence. "Answer me, dang it!" the voice rasped. Then from the darkness to the right came a sudden, violent scuffle, a choked gasp, a heavy thud, and then silence again. A thick, final silence. A match scraped, and the lantern flared back to life. Abel stood over the body of a Grayson henchman, a knife in his hand. The man's eyes were wide and staring, his rifle lying useless beside him. Lena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her legs threatening to give out. Abel looked at her, his face grim in the flickering light. "They have guards posted," he said. "It's going to be slow going." They pushed deeper, moving with excruciating slowness. The single tunnel began to branch, opening into a confusing network of passages. Abel consulted his father's hand-drawn map, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was clear the Graysons had expanded the old mine workings significantly. After another hour, the air began to change. The damp, earthy smell was replaced by the scent of hay, livestock, and oiled leather. They were getting close. Abel found a small fissure in the rock wall and peered through. His whole body went rigid. He motioned for Lena to look. Her eyes widened. They were looking down into a massive cavern, lit by dozens of lanterns. It was a hidden fortress. At one end, there were pens holding at least 100 head of stolen cattle. Crates of supplies were stacked high against the walls, crates bearing the markings of the Union Pacific Railroad. In the center of the cavern, a group of men sat around a fire, drinking and talking. And among them, looking smug and confident, were the two remaining Grayson brothers and their father. But that wasn't the worst of it. Chained to a support beam near the fire was another man, his face bruised and bloody. It was the town sheriff. He wasn't a partner in their crimes. He was their prisoner. Samuel must have gone to him with his suspicions, and the Graysons had simply made him disappear. They were more powerful and more ruthless than either of them had ever imagined. The whole operation, Lena whispered, horrified. It's all here. Abel nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the cavern, taking in every detail. The number of men, their positions, the layout of the stolen goods. He wasn't just looking, he was planning. The evidence is here, he said, his voice a low growl. But it's no good to us if we're dead. He pointed to a stack of wooden crates in a dark corner of the cavern, far from the fire. They were smaller than the others, marked with a stark red X. Dynamite, Abel breathed. Left over from the mining days. Enough to bring this whole mountain down. A new, terrifying plan began to form in his eyes. He wasn't just here for justice anymore. He was here for annihilation. He was going to bury the Graysons and their entire criminal empire in a tomb of their own making. We have one chance, Abel whispered, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. We create a diversion, something to draw them all to one side of the cavern. Then we get to that dynamite. The diversion had to be big. It had to be loud. It had to be convincing. Lena's eyes fell on the cattle pens. The livestock, she said. If we could spook them. Abel nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. It's a start. They backtracked through the tunnels until they found a narrow passage that, according to Abel's map, ran along the backside of the cavern near the cattle pens. They could hear the lowing of the animals through the rock. It took them 20 minutes of prying with Abel's knife, but they managed to loosen a large section of the rock wall, creating a small opening that looked into the pens. The plan was simple and insane. Abel would create a rock slide at the main entrance to the cavern, sealing it off. The sound would draw the Grayson gang's attention. In the confusion, Lena would use their small opening to spook the cattle, sending 100 panicked animals stampeding through the cavern, right towards the gang. And in that chaos, Abel would make a run for the dynamite. Once I have it, he said, handing her a book of matches, I'm going to set a long fuse. When you see me light it, you get out. You run back the way we came and you don't look back. Understand? Lena's heart hammered. What about you? I'll be right behind you, he lied. She could see it in his eyes. He had no intention of making it out. This was his final stand. His revenge for his sister, for his parents, for Samuel, for her. There was no time to argue. He squeezed her hand one last time. Be ready, he whispered, and then he was gone, melting back into the darkness. Lena was left alone, crouched by the opening, the sound of the cattle and the distant laughter of the gang filling the silence. She waited. Each second was an eternity. She thought about Abel's sister, about her own husband, about the life that had been stolen from her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But something else was growing alongside it, a burning, righteous anger. The Graysons had taken everything. They would not take this. Then she heard it, a low rumble from the far side of the cavern. It grew quickly, becoming a deafening roar. The ground shook. Dust and rock rained down from the ceiling. Abel had done it. The entrance was sealed. Shouts of alarm and confusion erupted from the gang. What in tarnation was that? The main tunnels collapsed. This was her chance. With trembling hands, Lena struck a match. She lit a corner of her shawl until it was smoldering, then shoved it through the opening into the hay of the cattle pen. The dry hay caught instantly, flames licking up towards the wooden beams. The cattle smelled the smoke. A few nervous bellows turned into a wave of panic. Lena yelled, waving her arms, making herself as big and terrifying as she could. The panicked animals surged against the gate, their eyes wide with terror. The cheap wooden latch splintered. And then 100 terrified half-ton animals exploded into the cavern. It was chaos. A river of horns and hooves stampeding directly towards the fire and the disoriented gang members. Men screamed and dove for cover. Lanterns were smashed, plunging half the cavern into darkness. The carefully organized criminal enterprise was reduced to a swirling vortex of panic and terror. Through the mayhem, Lena saw a figure darting along the cavern wall, moving with purpose. Abel. He ran low and fast, using the stampeding cattle as a moving shield. He reached the crates of dynamite, but the Graysons had seen him. Old Man Grayson and his two sons, recovering from the initial shock, opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls around Abel. He ignored them, his hands working frantically to pry open a crate. He pulled out several sticks of dynamite, bundling them together. Lena watched in horror as one of the Grayson sons took careful aim. She lifted her revolver, the one Abel had given her. It felt impossibly heavy. Her hands shook. "Point it at whatever you don't want living anymore," his voice echoed in her head. She aimed at the man who had helped murder her husband and pull her life apart. She squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked, the sound lost in the roar of the stampede. The Grayson's son crumpled to the ground. One down. The shot drew their fire. Bullets whined past her head, chipping stone from the rock she was hiding behind. But she had bought Abel the time he needed. He had the fuse lit. It was sputtering, a tiny, deadly spark eating its way towards oblivion. Abel turned and ran, not for the exit, but deeper into the tunnels, drawing Old Man Grayson and his remaining son after him. He was leading them away, giving her a clear path to escape. "Lena, go!" he roared over the chaos. "Now!" She didn't hesitate. She scrambled back into the narrow tunnel, her lungs burning, her body screaming with adrenaline. She ran, stumbling in the dark, the sounds of the cavern fading behind her, the screams of men, the bellowing of cattle, the sharp crack of gunfire. She had to get out. She had to live. She had to tell their story. She burst out from behind the waterfall into the pre-dawn light, gasping for air, her clothes soaked, her body bruised. She didn't stop. She kept running, up the creek bed, towards the smoke that was still rising from the smoldering ruins of Abel's barn. She risked one look back at the mountain, and then the world turned white. A silent flash, followed a second later by a roar so profound it felt like the world was being torn in two. The ground bucked beneath her feet, throwing her to the dirt. The entire face of the mountain seemed to bulge outwards, and then collapsed in on itself in a tidal wave of rock and dust. The waterfall vanished. The entrance to the tunnels was gone. The tomb was sealed. The Graysons, their entire operation, their legacy of cruelty and greed, were buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock. Lena lay on the ground, the silence that followed even more deafening than the explosion. Dust rained down around her. It was over. Justice had been done. But Abel was gone. He had traded his life for hers, his vengeance for her future. The grief hit her then, a raw, physical wave that left her breathless. She had won. She was free, but she was alone. She slowly got to her feet and began the long walk back to the ruins of the house. As the sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, the same ridge where the Graysons had watched her, its light fell on a valley that was finally, truly, at peace. She reached the house, a stone shell against the morning sky. The fire in the barn had died down to embers. The world was quiet. She sank down on the porch steps, the revolver still clutched in her hand, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself weep. She cried for her husband. She cried for Abel's sister. And most of all, she cried for the quiet, vengeful, honorable man who had saved her, only to be consumed by the very fire he had set. She sat there for hours as the sun climbed higher. The valley was silent, still. It was her land now, hers and Abel's, a place bought with blood and sacrifice. She didn't know how she would go on, how she would rebuild from the ashes. But she knew she had to honor them, to live the life they had given her. As the morning wore on, a sound reached her, a faint rhythmic sound. Hoofbeats. Her head snapped up, her hand tightening on the revolver. Had someone survived? Was it not over? A lone rider appeared, coming not from the collapsed mountain, but from the west, from the direction of the town. He was leading a second horse. As he got closer, her heart stopped. It was Abel. He was battered, bruised, his clothes torn, but he was alive. He rode up to the porch and swung down from his horse, his movements stiff and sore. He looked at the devastation around them, the smoking barn, the bullet-scarred house. Then he looked at her. Lena could only stare, unable to process it. "How?" she finally whispered. "The map," he said, his voice rough. "My father's map. There was another way out, an old air shaft on the far side of the mountain. I never thought it was passable, but it was. I drew them in deep, then doubled back. I was clear just before it blew." He took a step towards her, then another until he was standing right in front of her. He gently took the revolver from her hand. "It's over, Lena," he said softly. "It's finally over." Relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over her. He was alive. They were both alive. They had survived. A few days later, a federal marshal, summoned by a letter Abel had sent weeks prior, arrived in the valley. Lena and Abel told him everything, the story corroborated by the chained and grateful town sheriff, whom Abel had freed from the cavern before the explosion. The Grayson Empire was officially dead and buried. The land, free and clear, was registered in both their names. They rebuilt, slowly, piece by piece. They raised a new barn from the ashes of the old one. They mended the fences, cleared the fields, and planted new seeds. The work was hard, but it was honest work. It was healing. The silence returned to the valley, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't born of fear or unspoken grief. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled with the small sounds of a life being built together. One evening, months later, Lena was washing dishes when she noticed the old broken teacup she had found, one of his mother's. She had painstakingly glued it back together, the fine cracks like a map of its history. Abel came in from the barn and saw her looking at it. He walked over, picked it up, and ran a rough thumb over the mended cracks. He looked at Lena, and for the second time since she'd known him, he smiled. A true, real smile that reached his eyes. "It's stronger now, you know," he said, his voice quiet. "Where it was broken." They stood there in the lamplight, two survivors, scarred but not shattered. They had been brought together by violence and hate, but they had forged something new in the fire, something strong, something lasting. They had found more than just justice in that violent, unforgiving land. They had found a home. If you enjoyed this story and believe that even in the darkest of times, courage can light the way, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.